Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Diana, and I send you greetings from Vancouver, Canada. I am an aspiring PhD student. I would like to start my PhD in change management at the University of Business Studies in Bucharest. This presentation today is a snapshot into how cultural dimensions influence individuals' response to change in organizations. I hope you can see the screen, and let us begin. We'll talk a little bit about resistance. There is an estimate that around 70% of change initiatives in organizations fail, which is a surprisingly high number. And the main reason for that is deemed to be the individual's resistance to change. And throughout the years, scholars have developed, and also business people have designed several change management models in order to address and to reduce resistance. And these are just a few of them. And you might be more familiar with Levin's change model, maybe one of the first ones, McKinsey 7 steps, Kotter's 8-step model, and Hyatt's ADGAR model, which is probably the one that is most employed today. The problem or the challenge with these models is that besides being very helpful, there are some little shortcomings. So they suggest the same approach irrespective of the context where the where the change takes place, meaning that they do not account for the maturity of the organization or the economical context of the organization or the past experiences with change in organizations. And furthermore, they do not account for the existing resistance. And what I mean by this is that there is a resistance that is there already before the change is initiated. What these models address is more the resistance that is created because of the characteristics of the change. So the change, they address the resistance that arises because, for example, of the scope of the change that is about to be initiated or the duration. But they do not account for the resistance that already exists in organization before that change. And furthermore, they don't address the aspects of culture affecting the resistance or the change readiness. So this is why this presentation is going to focus on the cultural aspects that affect the response of the change recipients when confronted with the change initiatives. And when I say change recipients, I mean the people that are going to live with that change after the change is initiated. And of course, I'll also suggest some further research. The methodology employed here is a literature review of the English-speaking landscape dealing with change management and with culture. A little bit more about the resistance of the individual. Coughlin defines it as the behavior of the employees who are unwilling to accept and support the implementation of the organizational change. Pretty self-explanatory. And we find there are several layers of resistance. The resistance of the individual is personal, based on their own background, maybe based on their personal life context. You can imagine that someone that goes through a big life change, as for example, maybe they have a kid or they're divorcing or they're moving, they are less open to change when it comes to their workplace. Then there's the resistance influenced by the group. So we have our peers and we are influenced by how they react to change. If everyone is open to change, then we tend to be more open to change. If there are resistance to change, then we usually don't want to be separate from what the herd um, says or how they react. And last but not least, we have the resistance influenced by the organization overall. And then Harting and Hofstede, probably you've heard about Hofstede, it says that resistance to change has a universal, a cultural, and a personal aspect. So that means that culture is relevant in understanding the resistance that change initiatives face in organizations. Now let's look into organizational culture. Culture is overarching. As we saw, there's culture at all levels, as that a personal, group, organizational levels, and affect how people talk, how they think, how they behave, and of course, how they respond to change. A group of scholars did an amazing study where they compared 125 cultural models. And based on all of these models and what they have learned, they said that the organizational culture is a group's shared set of distinct basic assumptions, values, practices, and artifacts, facts that are formed and retained over a long period of time. Sounds kind of right, right? Additionally, Schein, who is one of the first scholars that aimed to define change, said to define culture, said culture is what a group learns over a period of time as that group solves its problems in survival in an external environment and its problems of internal integration. So let's analyze this a little bit. What does this mean? It means that culture influences how people solve their problems, which means how they approach change. And that also how they approach change, right? So by solving problems, they address an external factor, which leads to change in order for them to remain competitive and to survive as an organization, but also means how they deal with the internal problems that also, in order to be solved, some changes need to occur. So what does that mean? It means that change management needs to take into consideration culture, because based on culture, people solve their problems. Cultural models. As I said, a group of amazing scholars did this comparison between 125 models, cultural models, and one of their conclusions was that, of course, it's hard to capture all aspects of culture in one model. And they also said that some models are more appropriate in some situations and some in others. They also noticed that the number of dimensions per model increases from 6 in Hofstede's model to 18. However, we are going to use Hofstede in this particular presentation because Hofstede covers most of the relevant and prevalent aspects of culture. So irrespective of how many dimensions or aspects cultural models entail, they still cover, Hofstede does cover these to a very high percentage. And on top of that, we are going to use Erin Meyer's model of who has around 8 aspects of culture. We're going to compare the two models and then establish the effect that they have on the individual's resistance to change. So Gerd Hofstede's model. As promised, we're going to look into both of them. These are the 6 dimensions of Geert Hofstede's model. Please note that the last 2 have been added a little bit later. Power distance, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, uncertainty avoidance, long versus short-term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. Let's look into each of them. Power distance means the degree of inequality between managers and their employees. Here we have top-down decisions. Managers decide what happens to the organization and people follow. Individualism versus collectivism, the degree to which people in a country prefer to act as individuals rather than members of the group, which means that when people decide, they decide more as a group rather than as an individual in collectivism. Masculinity versus femininity, the degree to which people value assertiveness, performance, success, and competition versus quality of life, maintaining warm relationships, service, care for the weak, and solidarity. So I think here we can see that there's competition and versus being concentrated on being nurturing relationships. Uncertainty avoidance, as you might anticipate, this is really relevant for how people see change. This uncertainty avoidance means the degree to which people prefer structure and rules to guide their reactions and behavior in given situations. Long versus short-term orientation means the degree to which people plan for the future, right? We can focus just on what happens today and maybe tomorrow, or we can look further in the future and try to plan. So this is that idea of delayed reward. And I guess you can kind of anticipate how this affects the openness to change or the resistance to change. And indulgence versus restraint is how people see fun and enjoying life. Let's go into the second model. The dimensions here are communicating, evaluating, persuading, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, and scheduling. And again, you don't have to remember them already. We are going to look into each of them. What means communication? Communicate or communicating. Communicating ranges from low context, which means precise, simple, and clear communication, to high context, which means sophisticated, nuanced, and layered, where messages are read between the lines. Evaluating ranges from direct negative feedback, which means that you provide feedback frankly, bluntly, and honestly, to indirect negative feedback, which means that you provide feedback softly, subtly, diplomatically. Persuading ranges from principles first, meaning that we set the primary emphasis on theoretical frameworks, to application first, where the primary emphasis is on practical and concrete applications. So I think this is not as straightforward, and I will explain it a little bit further. So when it comes to principles first, people want to see, in order to persuade someone, you need to bring them statistics. You need to bring them theoretical frameworks, maybe, I don't know, research papers. They need to see the plan. They need that type of theoretical proof that something will work in order to be persuaded. When it comes to application first, people need to see case studies. They need to see how things were done in the past and what has succeeded in the past. Leading ranges from egalitarian, meaning flat organizational structures, to hierarchical, high distance between manager and employees, and high importance of status. You might actually notice how similar this is to the idea of power distance from the Hofstede model. But I'm getting ahead of myself right now. Deciding ranges from consensual decisions made through unanimous agreement to top down, where decisions are made by the manager. Trusting ranges from task-based, which means trust is built through business-related activities, to relationship-based. Relationships build up slowly over the long term. What does this mean? It means that in a task-based society or organization, people tend to focus on projects. So we have this task that we need to solve together, and this is how we build trust. You prove your competency in this, and we work together in this. In other organizations that are more relationship based, trust is built over a long period of time, and this is how we build, that connection, and then are able to work together and then trust each other. Disagreeing ranges from confrontational, which means that disagreements are seen as constructive, to avoiding confrontation, where the above is perceived as inappropriate, having a negative effect for the team and organization. And this is very important, because if you are in an organization where disagreeing is not confrontational and you are confrontational, you will face resistance. And scheduling ranges from linear time, which means project steps are completed in a linear sequence, one after the other, without interruption, with focus on the deadline, as well as on the tasks that need to be fulfilled, to flexible time, where adapting and changing as external factors arrive is important. So the skill of adaptation, of continuous adaptation. And in this situation, in the case of flexible time, the interruptions are accepted, they are considered a given, and people just have to adapt. Now, let us look at both models and try to see what overlaps there are. When it comes to power distance, we see that in Aaron's model, this is covered by leading. High power distance, more hierarchical leading. High power distance means that people more or less avoid confrontation. This is a little bit of a stretch here, but you'll see that disagreeing appears in other areas as well. And deciding is, of course, top down when the power distance is large. Individualism versus collectivism. When we have more collectivism, it is possible that the decision-making process is more consensual. Not necessarily, but this has a little bit to do with it. And the trusting is more relationship-based in the collectivistic societies. Masculinity versus femininity. Again, we see trusting here, relationship-based trusting more in the feminine societies. Evaluating might be with more indirect feedback in a masculine societies where we have that type of competition, and disagreeing might be more towards the confrontational type in masculine societies. Interestingly enough, at least to the way that I analyzed these two models, I find that uncertainty avoidance is not necessarily covered by Erin Meyer's model. It could be covered a little bit by flexible versus linear scheduling, meaning that the linear scheduling is more of an uncertainty avoidance, and that avoidant organizational culture, whereas that flexible way of scheduling might be covered by a lesser uncertainty avoidance. Long versus short-term orientation and scheduling might have something to do with this. So long-term orientation is more towards a linear scheduling. Short-term orientation is goes more towards a flexible time scheduling. And this is not, there's no good or wrong or right here. It's just how cultures are. And in order for us to understand it, and in order for us to be successful at change, we need to understand them. Short-term orientation, I must say that sometimes I perceived it as something negative. However, there are societies where a lot of predictable things happen, where, for example, traffic is very high, which means that people will most probably be late for meetings. And you cannot necessarily find this as something negative when when the uncertainty is dictated by something external to the person or external to the organization. Indulgence versus restraint. I personally haven't seen anything that is necessarily corresponding to this. Then we have persuading, principles and applications first, from Aaron's model that I haven't found a correspondence to in hosted this model, and communicating, which is very important in change management. I haven't necessarily found an overlap with hosted this model. And here's the comparison again. And let's go into the discussion. So Hofstede actually, in the Hartzing and Hofstede, did some empirical research of how their dimensions affect resistance. So the higher the power distance means a more hierarchical culture with top-down deciding and confrontation avoidance leads to lower resistance. Higher individualism with task-based trusting. Remember, we talked about trusting, and the trusting is based on projects instead of relationship nurturing. It also leads to lower resistance, interestingly enough. So what is relevant here and interesting is that in cultures that are more prone to put importance on relationships, on collectivism, that's where higher resistance is found. Higher uncertainty avoidance, and this is probably fairly predictable, leads to higher resistance. And higher long-term orientation, meaning that people are okay with seeing the results and the rewards later in time, leads to lower resistance. Furthermore, the cultural models also provide recommendations regarding the potential tactics of change management, taking culture into consideration. They show how to best communicate about the change. And as I said, communication is really essential. Every single model of change management contains the idea of communication. So how do we communicate about the change? And the communication needs to be according to the culture. What persuasion approach do we use to convince people to change? So are we bringing theory first, or are we bringing them case studies? This is very important. How do we plan from the change from a time perspective? Do people need a clear plan, a sequence of steps, and clear deadline, or is the plan more flexible and allows for modifications? The cultural models also show whether to expect open pushback and how to find out what people think about the change. So remember that confrontation, how people disagree. If people disagree openly, so they allow confrontation, you as a change initiator will know clearly or clearer if they are resistant and why they are resistant, which actually leads to a better solving of the problem, because there is this knowledge. But there are other cultures where People avoid confrontation. So you might not know unless you ask or unless you do something about it in order for it to know why people are resistant to change and whether they are resistant. So how to give negative feedback is also something that is important, and how to reward positive and supportive behavior towards the change. So again, if someone is not supportive or not open to change, in some cultures, it's okay to give them negative feedback. In other cultures, it's not that okay to do it. So the above can provide concrete suggestions for the best context-specific tactics change initiators can employ. So from a conclusion perspective, change management models suggest the same approach, as I mentioned in the beginning, without accounting for context-specific things, and especially not accounting for culture. However, culture does influence the resistance to change, which is one of the main factors affecting change success. A combination of the two models, Hofstede and Meyer, provide a compelling image of the existing culture in a group or organization even before the change is initiated. And why is this important? Because change initiators can assess the existing resistance to change before a change is initiated. They can create a change management plan that is tailored to the exact context in which the change is initiated. And they can aim to change the culture mid to long term to a more open to change one. And why is this important? It's important because nowadays there are so many changes that happen. Changes happen a lot faster. An organization with a culture more open to change has more potential to be able to adapt to these fast changes in the environment. And when it comes to further research, the recommendations are the following: to empirically validate the impact of the Myers scales or 8-dimension model, and to validate concrete tactics for change management based on the findings about culture. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you very much for being here. It was my pleasure to be here, and I hope to see you again.